Welcome to the Road to Sold. Today we have a fantastic class prepared for you on how to handle the repairs inside of a real estate transaction. And with us to help guide us through the process is Walt Klein. Hey Walt, how are you doing today?
Very good. How are you doing, Cheyanne?
Great.
All right. Well, this afternoon we're going to talk about the issues surrounding repairs in a real estate transaction with a focus on two car forms, the request for repairs, the RR, and the seller response and buyer reply to request for repairs. Now, the agenda is going to be, I'm going to cover 6 areas. First of all, I'm going to talk about the seller's legal duty to make repairs. I'm going to next talk about the seller's legal duty to make disclosures. They go sort of hand in hand. Buyer's request for repairs, how that works. The seller's response to request for repairs. We'll talk a little bit about actually performing the repairs and then wrap up with talking about the final walkthrough as it relates to repairs. So let's get started with the seller's legal duty to make repairs. In the state of California, sellers have a very limited obligation to make repairs to a property in a sale transaction. Many agents are surprised by the fact that sellers can sell property with making virtually no repairs at all, and that's perfectly legal. Under the RPA, there are certain guidelines that kind of address that issue. The first one is that in paragraph 11, there's a statement that says that the property is sold as is in its present condition. So the property is sold the way it is with no guarantee repairs will be made. I like to say that a seller sells the property as is, and a buyer gets to determine what is, because the buyer has the right to conduct investigations of the property to determine the condition of the property. And if they feel like there's some things they're not comfortable with, they can actually request the seller to make repairs. There's another clause in the RPA that talks about repairs and the seller's obligation to make repairs, and that is 14b2. Again, the buyer may request the seller make repairs, but the seller has no obligation to repair or even respond to a buyer's request for repairs. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to the situation where a seller is not obligated to make repairs, and they revolve around 3 particular areas. One is smoke detectors, the other is water heater tank strapping, and the third area is low flow plumbing fixtures. So let's talk about them briefly. Although there's not an actual point of sale requirement to install smoke alarms or to strap the hot water heater, there is a requirement that the seller certify that is done. So it becomes virtually a point of sale requirement because the seller by law must, in a real estate transaction, certify that their smoke detectors are installed and that the hot water heater tanks are strapped. Now, if that's not the case, either party can pay for it. We don't recommend that the buyer pay for it, but it is negotiable who pays for it, but the seller must state that is done. With low flow plumbing fixtures, the situation in San Diego County is, and again, it's not a point of sale requirement statewide, but each locality can have their own rules, and their rules take precedent over the state rules. And so in the county of San Diego, the only city that requires low flow fixtures is the city of San Diego. And it is a point of sale requirement with one interesting caveat, and that is if the buyer agrees, the buyer can assume the installation of low flow fixtures if they're not already in the property and relieve the seller of that obligation. So there is a certificate that is filed with the city when either the seller or the buyer certifies that the property now has low flow fixtures, and that certificate is on file so that once a a certificate is filed in any future transaction, it's not an issue that needs to be addressed other than simply obtaining a copy of the certificate or the certificate number and including it in your file to indicate that, in fact, the low flow fixtures have been installed. There is not a requirement for a seller to make any health and safety repairs. That's often misunderstood by agents. They believe that any health or safety defect must be repaired prior to close of escrow. That's not true. And there's also no requirement for the seller to make repairs required by a lender. In fact, in paragraph 3D3, the seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy a lender requirements regarding any lender required repairs that have to be made. So there is a few caveats where repairs have to be done, but for the most part, not very much. Now, what is pretty extensive on the seller's part is the seller's legal duty to disclose. The seller has a very, very high level of disclosure requirements. They basically have to disclose any material fact known to them that might affect the value or desirability of the property, and that it is not within the diligent observation of a buyer. And that is expressly contained in the RPA in a couple of different places. One specifically in 11A, it states that the seller shall disclose all known material facts about the property. And so the question is often then, what gets disclosed and what doesn't get disclosed? Well, any time the seller thinks there's something that maybe affects his property, desirability of his property, he should disclose it. And that includes a question that's also often raised is whether or not a seller should disclose past repairs. In other words, a defect that did exist, but it's been repaired. And that is an interesting question. And there's a couple of thoughts about that to help maybe understand that a little bit. And that is on the TDS, there's two places that repairs are discussed. So any repairs that were made that might not have had permits pulled when that was required, or repairs that were made that might not have been in compliance with civil code, that must be disclosed. In the SBQ, it's even more extensive. Repairs and alterations, any repairs, including those resulting from a home warranty that were made, should be disclosed, and that there's an opportunity to list that on the SBQ. Also, any past defects that have been repaired should be disclosed, and then finally, any insurance settlements should be disclosed. Any repairs made as a result of insurance settlements. So there's quite a bit of responsibility, quite a large responsibility on behalf of the seller, on the part of the seller, to make disclosures to the buyer about the condition of the property, and it does include past repairs that are made. Another thought regarding repairs and disclosure of repairs, because sometimes sellers will push back against an agent about why do I need to disclose that? It's already fixed. Well, there's a couple of thoughts. And the first thought is that it might have been a chronic problem. A common example would be a toilet backs up, and maybe it backs up, once every 6 months or once a year. Maybe it only backed up once, but you had Roto-Rooter come out and they Roto-Rootered the roots, and now it's working, but those roots aren't killed forever. They're going to return in a year or 2 or 3. And that could be problematic for the seller later when the buyer has more problems as a result of a chronic problem the property has that at the time it was sold was fully repaired, but the problem could reoccur. The other reason to disclose repairs is, what if the repair was not done adequately? If a seller did not disclose a repair and the repair was not done adequately, the seller would probably have liability for problems the buyer had. Another great example is a garbage disposal leak that floods underneath the sink, and it kind of wrecks the cabinet under the sink. So the seller who's living in the home and taking good care of their home has it all nicely repaired and fixed. But what didn't happen is they didn't remove the cabinet itself, and the moisture that got under the cabinet caused mold to grow. And 6 months later, the mold becomes a problem for the buyer. And then we find out that the seller had made a repair, and the repair was maybe not as thorough as it could have been, and now becomes an issue the seller has. So there's very little uh, upside to not disclosing a repair. There's a lot of downside. Often, when a seller does not want to make a disclosure, ask the seller why, and they say, well, it'll affect the sale of my home. That's exactly the definition of a disclosure that needs to be made. So that's a common area of problems, relative disclosures and repairs, that you should be aware of. Now, there is another form that I want to bring your attention to, and within our company, we require this form. It's an excellent form, and that's the DIA, the Disclosure Information Advisory. And that's an advisory you should give to the seller prior to the seller filling out their disclosures. And there's a few paragraphs, there's a lot of paragraphs to cover a lot of areas, but relative to things like repairs, they talk a little bit about disclosing everything and anything you can think of. In paragraph H, they talk about even if you've repaired something, resolved it, it's no longer a problem, disclose the issue anyway. So this 3-page form is just loaded with good information to the seller, and a listing agent should ensure that the seller receive a copy of this prior to them making disclosures, and that will help the seller be more thorough in their disclosures.
Can I pause you for a second right here as well, too? On the disclosures, when you're working with a seller, one of the things that I like to tell our agents and our new agents that are working with the company is that when a buyer first writes an offer on their home, they're so excited about getting that accepted. They're thrilled with the prospects of finally finding that perfect home. So there's no better time for the sellers to make their disclosures than when the buyer is the most happy with the transaction. Anytime you push a disclosure problem towards the end of a transaction, or you give the seller's disclosures to the buyer later than they happen to be due, that's when you're going to really see the problems start to arise. So always being proactive in a transaction and handling these disclosure issues from the seller in their 7-day period of time towards the beginning of the transaction is going to help smooth the way later. So all of these disclosures that we've talked about so far should be completed and turned over to the buyer within the very beginning of the transaction. What we have 7 days to do that, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. The boilerplate says 7 days, and a common problem with fast escrows are problematic in themselves, but frequently agents and buyers and sellers will agree, let's close in 15 days, but they won't adjust the delivery of disclosures. So you still have 7 days to get the disclosures there. Now you've only got 8 days to respond to those disclosures and before close of escrow. So getting them in early is important. Getting them in there within the time frame the contract says is paramount. There's an interesting lawsuit that there was a cause of action because a buyer got disclosures after the physical inspection and claimed they were denied the ability to review the disclosures with their physical inspector. And that issue added to the buyer's damages. So another little side caveat relative to seller's disclosures is both the listing agent and the buyer's agent should ensure that the buyer has the seller disclosures prior to a physical inspection, which again puts a lot of pressure on the seller to get them off, and the seller's agent to get them off to the buyer's side of the transaction quickly. So good points, Cheyanne, to get it done in the time frame specified.
Another thought while we're talking about this is the forms that you've mentioned so far are some heavy hitting forms. We have your TDS, your transfer disclosure statement, and the SPQ, which is the seller property questionnaire. Now, those two forms are required to be completed by the seller and delivered to the buyer within that 7-day time period. But there's also one more form that's required to be addressed as well, and that is the AVID, the agent visual inspection disclosure. That's actually tied into the TDS, the transfer disclosure statement, and is also required to be submitted to the buyer within that 7-day period of time. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's so frequent that the listing agent will do their due diligence from the seller. They'll get the SPQ, they'll get a copy of the TDS, they'll consider their job done by delivering those two things, but they always forget to include their AVID at the beginning of the transaction. And we see that come through late frequently. So that is incorporated into the TDS and should be delivered along with those other two heavy hitting disclosures.
Absolutely. And like all disclosures, the AVID included, if they're delivered late, they reopen a contingency window, even contingencies that have been removed. And so a listing agent who delivers an AVID late to a buyer, that may reopen a contingency period, much to the seller's just distraught over that happening, and it was the listing agent's failure to timely deliver the AVID that caused the problem. So that's, again, getting those disclosures out on time quickly cannot be stressed enough.
Well, and the reason why I bring this up is because I know you're transitioning right now into the actual requests for repairs, but a buyer has a really hard time investigating a property in its entirety if they don't have all of these disclosures. Exactly. So making sure all of those heavy hitting disclosures are completed and delivered prior to even discussing our request for repairs, which is where we're headed into, because the buyer has to be made aware of the issues in order to generate their own investigations and requests for repairs that we're moving towards right now.
Let's talk about the buyer's request for repairs. And there's a couple of areas I want to talk about. And the first one is the buyer's right to perform an inspection. So the contract, like I said earlier, contains at least a couple of references that allow the buyer to conduct a buyer investigation. Paragraph 11B and again 14B1. Buyer has 17 days is the boilerplate after acceptance to complete their investigations. Now, the contract also allows for the buyer to make requests for repairs, as mentioned earlier. Again, paragraph 11B, buyer has a right to request seller to make repairs or take other actions. And again, 14B2, seller has the right within the timeframes contained in B1 to request the buyer make repairs and take other actions. And again, the buyer has the right to ask the seller to make repairs, and the seller has no obligation, though, to respond to that request. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that is contractually allowed. The seller can, pretty much ignore it. I don't recommend it, but we'll talk about that. All right, now let's actually talk about the request for repairs themselves. And so the request for repairs, the top of the half of the form is the buyer's request. And I see this form more often than one would like being misused because of something that's not understood by all agents. And that is paragraph 1, A, B, C, and D are cumulative. What I mean by that is any box checked, A, B, C, or D, is being asked for. They're not or, they're and. Think, I want 1A, and I want 1B, and I want 1C if you check those boxes. It's not or. Frequently, a mistake is made. An agent will list some repairs they want to make, or they'll accept a credit, so they'll check A and C, and if the seller agrees to it, the seller agrees to making the repairs and providing the credit, and that can be problematic later in the transaction when people figure out that they're not all on the same page relative to repairs. So 1A gives the seller an option, gives the buyer an opportunity to list the repairs they want to make. And if they cannot fit it on this form, I recommend you do not attach an addendum unless it makes a sense, because the addendum has a lot more detail than you want to create, because you can type on this form, and when you run out of room, a text overflow addendum generates automatically. So that is a nice clean way to list as much as you want on 1A. If you do in fact decide instead you're going to attach a list, be sure the list includes a few important factors on it. One is it needs to be titled. Two, it needs to be dated. And three, it needs to be signed by the parties. First, the buyer who's submitting it. And then if the seller ultimately agrees to it, they need to sign that list as well. So creating an addendum does create a little extra responsibility on the agents. So that's why I recommend the text overflow addendum, because that's all taken care of automatically for you. Now, in addition to or instead of either one, the buyer can also request a wood destroying pest clearance, and they can either request Section 1 or Section 1 and Section 2 by checking the appropriate box. Another common mistake is if the RPA already includes an obligation for the seller to provide a clearance, do not ask for it again here. Because if in the unfortunate situation where a seller rejects the buyer's requests and the buyer accepts the seller's rejection, it can be argued successfully that the contract was modified to remove the termite clearance because the buyer asked for it again and the seller said, I'm not going to give it to you. And that might cast cloud upon the original agreement in the RPA. Maybe you wrote the RPA up and you put in other terms, simply a statement saying a seller shall provide Section 1 termite clearance is often written. If the seller agrees to that, you do not need to check the box B because you already have that in your transaction. So don't duplicate that because it could come back to cause you trouble. Now, if a termite clearance is agreed to, the contract requires the seller to provide that clearance 5 days prior to close of escrow, and that's something you should be aware of. That can be modified, of course, but sometimes sellers wait till the last minute to get the property tented, and it can cause problems. Contractually, the buyer can insist on the seller doing it a little sooner than the day before escrow closes. Paragraph C is where the buyer requests a credit from the seller. Now, when a buyer requests a credit, there's some points that a buyer should be aware of, and the seller too, for that matter. Any credit agreed to here is separate and additional to any credit already agreed to in the RPA, unless you create some kind of writing combining them. So let's say the RPA had a $5,000 buyer credit for closing costs and the seller accepted that. And now in the request for repairs, the buyer wants $3,000. So the buyer would not write $8,000 here. They would write $3,000 here because they already have the $5,000. If the seller said, look, I'm giving you $5,000, I don't want to give you $3,000 more, I'll give you $6,000, they could create an addendum that says the entire credit, all credit, including the original credit and the repair for request credit, shall be $6,000. That can be in a separate writing and clarify that. But a number here is simply an addition to any other number agreed to. The other caveat that buyers especially should be aware of is that credits must be disclosed to the buyer's lender, and the total credits may be limited by the lender. And if they are limited, there's another where in paragraph 3J of the RPA, talking about lender limits on buyer credits, any credit the lender does not approve is lost. It is not converted later. You have to address that. You can't pay it to the buyer afterwards. It's gone. So be sure that you check with your lender to be sure the total credits, again, that earlier example, maybe you had a $10,000 closing cost credit in the RPA, and now you want 10,000 more for repairs, but your closing costs are only 18,000. The buyer is going to lose 2,000 of that. So be sure to check with the lender about being sure there's enough closing costs to absorb all the credits.
So I had this brought up a couple weeks ago, and the same situation arose, and the credit was exceeding the amount allowed by the lender. So the advice was what it came down to is the seller was already moved out of the state and didn't want to go through the hassle of fixing the property. So it was like $2,000 or $3,000 worth of repairs. So the buyer picked out the contractor that they were going to use after the close of escrow, and then they submitted a invoice. The contractor did to escrow, and escrow paid the contractor the $3,000 out of escrow as a workaround for that.
Yeah, that's an excellent, sort of workaround. And there are creative ways that are legal and that can be used to absorb that excess credit. So one thing is to go back and amend the repair agreement with an addendum that the seller will, in fact, pay for the repairs and will be paid out of escrow. You might be able to allow the buyer to authorize the payment, but I'm not sure. I think the payment would have to come from the seller's side because it's still his house. So they submit the bill and that's paid. Another way too is you can increase your closing costs. Sometimes we've done this, especially if it's only not a huge amount of money. But you can extend a home warranty. I think we've actually had a home warranty that was for 3 years rather than 1 year. You can also buy down the interest rate, for a short period of time or a long period of time, depending on how much money you have. So there are some creative ways to absorb that credit. The thing you don't want to do is wait until it's going to close and discover that, hey, what happened to my other $2,000? Well, that's gone. And especially once it's closed, there's not much that the buyer or the seller can do to resolve that problem legally. So pay attention to it. But there are, as Kenny said, there are some creative things that can be done that can maybe resolve that issue. Finally, 1D is the buyer requests the seller reduce the price. So again, you check any of those that you want to be requested, and that constitutes your request. Paragraph 2 is where you attach copies of inspection reports, other reports. Maybe if you're asking for a credit, maybe the buyer went out and got estimates, and to back up the request for the credit, they attach the estimates. So paragraph 2 gives you a place where you can list attachments to the repair request, supporting documentation, if you will, and provide that with it. Now, one of the things I want to address back on 1A is the difference between requesting a condition and requesting an action. It is sometimes very problematic when a repair request says kitchen sink leaks. And that often happens because sometimes agents don't really write a repair request. They copy things out of the physical inspection and paste that into the repair request. They highlight things, and often those things are observations of a condition. They're not actually requesting an action. So if if the kitchen sink leaks, what the buyer should be requesting is or either repair or replace kitchen sink faucet. There's even a problem where if you say, fix the leak, and the buyer thought he was going to get a new faucet, and the seller put in a washer, had the plumber put in a washer on a faucet that was not in the best of condition anyway. But in fact, the leak was repaired, the faucet wasn't replaced. So the buyer's not happy, and you got a problem. So make sure when you list things in 1A that it's the action the buyer wants taken. It should be action oriented and not descriptive oriented. You can support what you're requesting by saying faucet leaks, faucet is in very poor condition. Then you want to say buyer wants faucet replaced. So you'd say the seller shall replace faucet. We had a very expensive problem one time where a mixing valve in a shower didn't work very well. And so the buyer asked that the mixing valve, I think they used a phrase something like addressed or mixing valve doesn't leak, please take care of. Very, very poorly worded. So the seller discovered it would cost him more than $1,000 to replace the valve. So he asked the plumber, can you sort of rebuild the valve a little in place? Well, that's exactly what the plumber did. And it wasn't the best of repairs, but it worked. But the buyer was absolutely upset over the fact that they expected a new valve installed, and they didn't really ask for it specifically enough. So be careful that you clearly state what you want.
This is a continuing problem that we see quite frequently on a request for repair, where even if they are asking for an action to be done, there's no quality control, even with an actionable item, of exactly what the seller is going to replace. So if you ask them to replace a faucet, there's a big difference between quality of faucets that are on the market. Same thing with a dishwasher or an oven or any other repair. Heck, even a paint repair, if you ask them to patch and paint something, the assumption is it would be the same color, but what if the colors don't match? I mean, there's so many little issues that can happen when you're asking for the seller to actually make the remedy, and you're not specifying exactly what that remedy can be. So it seems like a lot of people are shifting into asking for a repair credit, because then the buyers can make that actionable item themselves. So perhaps they want an upgraded faucet. Now they'll take that money and they'll apply it towards the faucet of their choice. We find that it's better for the buyer, and it might be even easier inside of a request for repair to maybe get a quote on what all the repairs are that the buyer is wanting. And if it's a reasonable quote to address all of the issues that are there, that they're requesting that credit instead, so they can handle it in their own way after the close of escrow, getting exactly what they want.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I would agree. It's always better to negotiate a credit over a repair. The contract does have boilerplate that says, for example, the faucet, it has to be similar to the one you're replacing. So, or take a dishwasher. I mean, some dishwashers can be more than $1,000. Some can be $400 or $500. If you have $1,000 dishwasher that needs to be replaced and the seller agrees to it, the contract really does not allow the seller to put a $400 washer in. You'd have to get the $1,000 replacement closest match possible. But it is an issue. So Cheyanne, you bring up a great point. It becomes a debate. Often, if you get a credit, you get a quote, you get a credit, and then you can add a few dollars to it and even upgrade. It wouldn't be at the seller's expense, but you could take the credit, apply it to, that $500 dishwasher that you wanted replaced, but I'm going to take another few hundred and get an $800 dishwasher. The only issue might come up where we talked about already, you've already absorbed all the credits you can get and you still want more repairs done. You may be forced to have some things repaired, but in general, credits should be your first choice.
But I think that this really closes back to what you started with. When you're looking at a request for repair and you see item number 1A, B, C, and D, you can select multiple things. So, for example, if you don't want to ask for a credit of $8,000 because there's termite work and a leak and these other miscellaneous repairs, you might ask for section 1 work to be completed and then an additional credit for the difference of those other small items. So like you had said initially, it is A and B and C and D, if applicable, in every scenario. So sometimes it might be best practice to select more than one of these items and really finesse the way you work with the request for repair for a buyer.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say that the problems that I see, and I see problems more than transactions that don't have problems, I don't get called when transactions are going smoothly, is where a seller made the mistake of thinking, well, I'm not going to make the repairs and give them a credit. I thought it was an or thing. Usually buyers frequently ask for more than one thing, an A, a B, a C. And usually my experience is they want all three. My concern is always that sometimes listing agents think that they can provide the credit instead of making that long list of repairs. So they agree to it and they find out you're going to do both.
One other tip that I want to give is going back to when you said the inspectors will write they'll often copy and paste off of the physical inspection report. A lot of times the inspector, because that's their job, is to say plumbing done by a licensed plumber, electrical to be done by a licensed electrician. So sometimes you'll get small repairs like a GFI needs to be replaced. They'll just copy and paste by a licensed electrician, which is going to be like 3 times the cost. And you can get almost any handyman or the homeowner or a homeowner's friend to make that repair very easily. So I guess the tip and advice that I would give to that is if there's scope of work that could be done without a licensed professional, you should address that at that time in the response for requests for repairs if you don't plan on having a licensed, bonded, and insured contractor doing those repairs.
Right. Sometimes the builder, the inspector, rather, will say licensed electrician to perform that repair, and the agent just puts it in, and now the seller is objecting to it. Not so much he doesn't want to fix the light switch, but he doesn't understand why he would incur that cost. So making your repair request as seller friendly as possible, still protecting the buyer, still making sure that the buyer gets their issues addressed. And to that same point, it's exactly what I was covering and what I talked about before. So our recommendations, make sure you provide plenty of backup for what you're requesting. To ask for a $3,000 credit for the electrical problems in the garage, and there's no estimate, the seller's going to say, well, I can fix that for $500. Why would I do that? When in fact, maybe you actually thought, 3,000 was enough, but you have some estimates for 4. So provide that $4,000 estimate. You're asking for 3, and now it becomes far more seller friendly. Look, I got $4,000 worth of expense there. I just want you to give me 3 to fix that. So those are things to keep in mind in preparing the request, because your goal is to get the seller to agree to the request. Okay, now the next issue then is, the buyer's prepared their request for repair. Now the seller is going to respond to the request. There are 2 different forms that are involved in the response. One is the bottom of the RR, and the other is possibly a completely unique RRRR. So let's look at that. The bottom of the RR contains a seller response, and these boxes are not cumulative. That's why I numbered them here on this note sheet. You would check only one of the boxes. So you have an option, and the first option is that the seller agrees to the buyer's response above. So if the buyer checked 3 boxes up here and the seller checked the first box, they would agree to all three of these. And so if the buyer agrees, then the agreement is conditioned upon the buyer removing the physical inspection contingency, and if checked, any contingencies on an attached contingency removal, and then the buyer stating affirmatively by signature on this form that they're releasing the seller and the brokers from any loss, liability, or expense due to the disclosed condition of the property. So if you check this box, then include the CR with your response. And I recommend to agents, if possible, to have it remove all contingencies. A suggestion is the seller should not perform repairs, and in fact, the seller is not obligated to make repairs until the buyer removes their contingencies. If the seller makes repairs, the buyer does not remove contingencies, and then the buyer later cancels, the seller has no source of funds to pay for those repairs, especially if they're costly. The seller may not automatically get the deposit, but at least it's available if the contingencies are removed and the seller ultimately prevails in their right to keep the deposit. Box 2 is the seller does not agree. It's as simple as that. The buyer filled out the top half, or the buyer's agent did, and the seller says, no, not doing any of it. I'm selling it just the way it is. I'm not making repairs. The seller's agent would check box 2. Box 3 is the seller responds to the buyer's request with an RRRR. 4 R's, an RRRR. So let's take a look at the RRRR. And this is a fairly detailed form. It starts with the seller's response to buyer's request. So the seller agrees. And again, like the repair request, top half, these are cumulative boxes. So if you check box A and B, you're going to agree to both of them. So checking A, you agree to all the buyer's requests, but obviously you don't agree to all of them, because if you did, you would have gone ahead and checked this box on the response. So there must be something you don't agree to, so you list that. So you see, the statement is that the seller agrees to all buyer's requests contained in repair number 1, for example, except, and I'm not replacing the dishwasher, for example. I'll do everything else, but the dishwasher that's there is the one I'm going to sell with the property. So you list whatever exception you have, and you can attach an addendum if you have a longer list. Now, unfortunately, and I just had this checked, the text overflow addendum does not generate when you type on this. So if you are accepting a lot of things, you're going to have to do an addendum. You might do an addendum that clarifies what you are going to do. Seller only agrees to the following and no other items, and you can list them that way. So you may have to attach an addendum because you don't have a lot of space here to list your exceptions, especially if you have a long repair request coming from the buyer. You can check the box that you'll credit the buyer a certain amount of money. You can check the box that you will reduce the purchase price, or you can check an other and what you do agree to. So depending on the circumstance of the transaction, there might be something that the seller will do, these are affirmative. So checking these boxes says you will do what you say you'll do. The one caveat being that you accept the things you're listing. So you simply list what you don't agree to do. Now, the seller's agreement only applies. So the seller says, I'll do the following, and he checks them. And then this agreement only applies if the buyer ultimately removes the physical inspection contingency and any contingencies attached on the CR, and by signature down below here, agrees to a release of the seller and the brokers for the disclosed condition of the property. Again, if there are credits, there are limits to the credits. So a seller might agree to a credit, but again, should check with the buyer's agent to be sure the credit can be utilized by the buyer, because it might exceed what the lender would allow. The buyer then responds to, or replies, perhaps a better phrase, the buyer replies the seller's response by determining what course of action they're willing to agree to. So if the buyer simply agrees to what the seller says here, then there's nothing further needs to be done except be signed, because the default statement is buyer accepts seller's response. So if the buyer accepts the seller's response contained above here, then he simply signs the form. Or the buyer accepts the seller's response with one modification, and the key word is one. Could you have two modifications? Maybe. Again, the overflow text addendum does not work here. And I've seen a lot of scribbling, a lot of confusion, because the buyer's modifying a 15 item list and wanting 14 of those items reinstated and trying to squeeze them all in. And do not do more than one or two at the most modifications, and they should fit on the blanks provided. If you have a lot of modifications, then you should simply withdraw you withdraw checkbox C and withdraw your repair request number, whatever the previous repair request number was, and replace it with a new request. So you've asked for 15 items. The seller says, I'm only going to do 3 of them, and the buyer wants you to do 7 of them. That's time to generate a new repair request, not to take advantage of the okay, I accept the 3, but I want 4 more. No, it's too many to squeeze here. Just replace it with a new repair request for repairs. Now, if the buyer accepts the seller's response in 1A, so they don't check any boxes, but they are accepting it, or the seller agrees to whatever the buyer's asking for in B, 1B, because he just wants one modification, and the seller says, okay, I'll do that, then the buyer will have been deemed to have withdrawn all other requests and remove the physical inspection contingency and any other contingencies on an attached CR that is signed by the buyer, and then agrees to the release above, the release contained in 2C above, right here. So that would occur if the buyer is accepting the seller's response, or the seller, by signature below, is accepting the seller's modification. Now, only if box 1B is checked here, the buyer accepts the seller's response with one modification, the seller can say, okay, I'll do that one more thing. So they check this box, seller agreement, seller agrees to buyer's modification above. Or seller says, nope, I'm not going to go with your modification. We're not adding that one more item back in. And he checks, no, I don't. And at that point, you would have to do a new request for repair if the buyer was still insisting on trying to get whatever they asked for up here agreed to, or they wanted to modify it yet again. They would do it with a new request for repair. So that takes us through the repair request forms themselves. They're pretty straightforward. They're pretty detailed. But if you go through them carefully, you should not have a lot of trouble in conveying the intent of the parties, especially keeping in mind some of the tips that Cheyanne, Kenny, and myself provided you. Okay, performing repairs. This is an issue that is not well understood by sellers and maybe not as well understood by agents as it should be. Sellers should understand when they agree to making repairs, the contract has some pretty stringent requirements in the boilerplate. And if they're not going to meet those requirements, they should you should talk with the seller about adjusting their agreement, because simply agreeing to repairs means that paragraph 16 would kick in. So repairs shall be completed and verified prior to the final walkthrough. So the first thing the seller's agreeing to doing is the repairs 5 days prior to the close of escrow, because the final walkthrough, we'll talk about that in a minute, can occur within 5 days of the close of escrow. So the seller's agreeing to perform them maybe more timely than they thought. They were going to wait until the day before escrow closed. Well, that's not what the contract said. They also agree that the seller can perform the work him or herself, or they can hire somebody else to do the work, but the work must comply with applicable law, including the pulling of permits. So in the example earlier where we were replacing a GFI, I'm not sure a permit would be required to put in a new GFI, since it's probably well under the dollar amount. But if you're rewiring the whole garage, fixing up the garage wiring because it was so poorly done, that might require a permit. Interestingly enough, hot water heater installations require permits. Now, they're not always obtained, but the seller is agreeing that if a permit is required, they will get the permit. So they should be aware of what commitment they're making. Now, the other thing that they must document the repairs in two ways. One is, if they're hiring somebody to make repairs, they must provide the buyer with invoices and receipts for the work performed by others. And if the seller's doing the work themselves, provide a written statement of the repairs they performed and the date they performed the repairs, and copies of any invoices and receipts associated with that repair. And that must be provided to the buyer prior to the final verification, so prior to the 5 days before close of escrow. So there should be some documentation that the repairs were completed, other than just the VP, which is the documentation the buyer provides. They're inspecting the property prior to close of escrow and confirming for themselves that the repairs have in fact been done. As I said, there's other documentation that paragraph 16 requires. So a diligent buyer's agent is going to ask for these items, and a diligent listing agent is going to be sure the seller understands of their obligation to provide these items and have them available to the buyer's agent. And then finally, the final walkthrough. So the final walkthrough, there's one important clause in this clause that's misunderstood. So I'll talk about that in a moment. I'll talk about the whole paragraph. The final verification of condition is accomplished by a walkthrough 5 days prior to close of escrow. You can modify that date. And it is not a contingency of the sale. What that means is, it is not an investigative opportunity to re-explore things that have not already been explored. So you can't open up new contingencies. You can't make new requests for repairs. It is, though, an opportunity to confirm that the repairs are in fact done. And if the repairs are not done, and they're material in nature, by that I mean the damage that the buyer would suffer by closing prior to getting those repairs done afterwards could be greater. The damage to the buyer getting the repairs done afterwards could be greater than the damage of delaying the close of escrow until those repairs are done. Is in fact a factor in the walkthrough. So when a buyer does a walkthrough and he finds that repairs are not done, this clause here doesn't say that the buyer can't take some action. He can. He can give the seller a notice to perform. He can, as I said, if it's a material matter, refuse to close, or more probably, if it's not material, close and then hold the buyer accountable afterwards. If in fact, hold the seller accountable afterwards. If in fact the buyer elects to close but wants to preserve the right to hold the seller accountable, the buyer, through the buyer's agent, should send a statement to the listing side of the transaction stating that the buyer's closing should not be deemed as the buyer accepting the repairs, and the buyer is preserving their right to seek damages for the repairs that were not completed. Don't just close and then expect to go to small claims court and collect on the repairs that weren't done, because judges have sometimes said, look, you closed, you accepted it. Once you say, look, I'm going to close, but I'm not accepting the repairs, that pretty much protects the buyer's ability to go after the damages that they suffer having to do the repairs themselves after close of escrow. So you document the verification, the condition, the fact that repairs are done with the verification of property condition, and you list the exceptions. The boilerplate says the buyer has satisfied themselves that the repairs are completed. If there are exceptions, you list them and provide that to the listing agent. Both the buyer's agent and the listing agent should get a verification of condition, a VP, prior to close of escrow. Something that comes up frequently, and there's two areas, same issue, but two reasons. One is doing a verification of property condition after escrow closes. That can be very problematic, because if escrow's already closed and then you're doing a verification, there's no documentation that that condition existed prior to close of escrow. And if the seller could argue that's a new condition, the buyer is not going to be able to sustain any claim they have as a result of what they observed on a walkthrough they did 3 days after close of escrow. That's not a good practice. Now, and then the other factor is that if the seller has possession of the property after close of escrow and an SIP is not used, seller in possession, then when escrow closes, the seller becomes a tenant, the buyer becomes a landlord. Where that can be problematic is, let's say the seller is going to stay in the property for 1 week and an SIP is not used, and I'll talk about why you want to use an SIP in a moment. If an SIP is not used, the seller stays in the property and then moves out 1 week later because somebody wrote an addendum saying seller to remain in property, pay buyers PITI for 1 week. And that's all they wrote. That's a very poor approach, because guess what? Tenants don't replace hot water heaters. Landlords do. So if the buyer moves in a week after the seller after it closes, and the seller just moved out, and the buyer moves in and discovers the hot water heater not working, if he can't prove it wasn't working when it closed, he's going to lose in court, because the judge is going to say tenants are not responsible to maintain hot water heaters unless you can prove that it was already not working when the tenant owned it as a seller. We're not going to make the seller as a tenant provide the buyer as a landlord a new hot water heater. And believe it or not, that's actually happened within our organization on more than one occasion. So that is very, very important to keep in mind. And that's why an SIP is so important, because an SIP says that when the seller moves out, he'll deliver the property in the condition it was at the time escrow closed, and the property, and in the condition the property was at the time the offer was accepted. So if a problem came up after a week and the seller just moved out, the seller would still be responsible for replacing the hot water heater because the SIP sort of extends the VIP time frame, if you will. If you're using a residential lease after sale, be sure you put in there that seller agrees to maintain property in the condition it was at the time the offer was written. If you don't put that in the RLAS, residential lease after sale, and this hot water heater problem came up, again, you would have a difficult time prevailing in small claims court to get a new hot water heater because the seller, as a tenant, wouldn't be responsible for the condition of the hot water heater. The seller would be as a tenant if he agreed to maintain the property in the condition the property was at the time the offer was written, subject to repairs that were agreed to. So, important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you so much for all of this information that you've provided us with today. I'd like to take a little bit more of your time and kind of circle around a few of these topics because although you've done an excellent job explaining the application of these documents that we have, so many situations change, right? There's so many different examples that we could circle back and forth on, and there's a lot of confusion with how to handle some specific things inside of a transaction. And the largest aspect it seems like we have a problem with is within this last 5 days. It happens when the seller is making repairs, the quality of the repairs, and the completion date of the repairs, and then the buyer closing on the property. So a lot of it happens at the end of escrow, 5 days prior to the close of escrow, when the buyer is going to the home and they're doing their final verification, where these problems arise. We have the final verification of property within 5 days prior to the close of escrow, not as a contingency of the sale, but just to confirm the repairs that were done, right? So most people are aware of this paragraph. They kind of know what it means, but this is where buyers and sellers don't always agree, right? So the buyers get to the home, they're going through their request for repair that was accepted by the seller, and they're not satisfied with the repairs that the seller made. So the seller has the obligation to give them copies of the receipts and the reports, and the buyers can verify if they accept those receipts and reports. But really, we're on a timeline here. Like the buyers at this point in time, they're planning to move into their home. So it's not very realistic that the buyers can usually say, whoa, 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 I'm going to stop and I'm not going to proceed forward, because they have to have somewhere to move in the next 5 days. So usually it gets a little ugly at this point in time in the transaction when the buyer is not satisfied with the repairs and they were planning to move in within 5 days from the close of escrow. You know, you could have had loan docs drawn already. Things have moved forward where the buyers are going to be forced to close to a certain degree. Are they really forced to? No, but the situation places them in difficulty. So kind of walk through some scenarios if the buyer is not happy at this point in time.
If you pay attention to timelines, 5 days prior to close of escrow, you should be getting copies of receipts and statements from sellers of the work they've done. And if the buyer's agent tries to enforce that, you can sometimes uncover issues. I mean, it's still maybe 5-6 days prior to closing, but it's not the night before. Frequently, walkthroughs happen the night before, one day before, and that's where you discover, wait a minute, this isn't right. When you have 5 days ahead of time and you look at receipts and statements, you might be able to discuss it with the seller and maybe resolve getting somebody back out there. Another issue is you want to know who's done the work, because civil code applies a labor warranty to contractors who do work. And that labor warranty is transferable. So in other words, if I hire a plumber to put a hot water heater in, the hot water heater warranty will apply to the new buyer. So if that water heater developed a leak later in one of the connection pipes 3 months later, if you knew who the contractor who put the hot water heater in was, that would be a benefit to the buyer. So those are just a couple of reasons why getting those receipts within 5 days is extremely important.
If I were representing a seller, I'd of course want to make sure any issues were cleared up and fully accepted prior to the close of escrow. If a buyer put something like that in writing to me, I wouldn't want to see this transaction close whatsoever. So, we have two sides of the transactions we're trying to protect here when we're doing this final verification. And anytime I've ever seen a buyer write anything on that verification of condition at the end of a transaction that doesn't say no exceptions, I don't know too many sellers and listing agents that want to accept that.
Anytime there's a dispute, it's imperative, and I tell agents that if there's a dispute or potential for a dispute, it's imperative that you bring management into it, because there are things that need to be done. I mean, on a small side of it, on a simple side of it, it's simply having a conversation maybe with the other side and getting it resolved. On a major side, it could be an insurance, an E&O issue. And so, and I like what you say. I mean, if the VP has something on it that is problematic, that should be pointed out to management. What do we do about this? Where do we go from here? And, we don't make decisions for our clients, but we're obligated to provide our clients with enough information that they make what is hopefully the best decision possible for them. And so getting management involved when there's a dispute over repairs, a dispute over the final walkthrough, all these sorts of things, it can be very, very problematic if you don't.
I think that's an excellent point to really close this out with, because I think that's what agents like to do, is they like to come to a 100% resolution. And there's going to be transactions where that's not always possible. And we understand that there is underlying things that are going to happen. And this is a point in time in the transaction where you're going to see that. So they're not always perfect. It is unusual to have a problem in every transaction. And if you do run across one, make sure you take it up the chain. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Walt. As always, your expertise is very valuable to us. We look forward to having you again soon on the road to Sold.